On January 3, 2026, American military helicopters descended on a Venezuelan military base in the early morning darkness. They came for one man, Nicolás Maduro. By sunrise, the president of Venezuela and his wife were aboard a U.S. Navy vessel, headed for New York to face criminal charges. The operation was surgical, decisive, and according to the Trump administration, bloodless. But this wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. There were no tanks rolling through Caracas, no occupation announcements. Instead, it was the final move in a 25-year chess game played for control of something far more valuable than territory, the world's largest proven oil reserves. Venezuela sits on top of nearly 300 billion barrels of crude. That's more oil than Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran combined. Yet today, this resource-rich nation produces less oil than Iraq, and most Venezuelans live in poverty so severe that 75% of the population lost an average of 19 pounds during the crisis years. How does a country with the world's most valuable natural resource collapse into humanitarian catastrophe? The answer isn't accidental. It's a story of oil, power, and how superpowers reshape nations in the name of democracy. It starts in 2001 with a man who dared to say no. Hugo Chávez had taken power in 1998, promising to use Venezuela's oil wealth for the poor, a radical idea in a country where the richest lived in penthouses while the masses lived in cardboard shacks stacked on hillsides. In his first years, Chávez did something that terrified Washington. He passed the Organic Hydrocarbons Law, reasserting Venezuelan state control over oil and gas reserves. For decades, American corporations had ruled Venezuelan oil. They extracted at will, paid minimal taxes, and kept 90% of profits for themselves, while Venezuela's poorest remained trapped in cycles of hunger and disease. Chávez's law changed that equation. It said, this oil belongs to Venezuela, to Venezuelans, not to ExxonMobil, not to Chevron. The decree held that foreign companies could participate in downstream operations, refining and distribution, but upstream activities belonged to the state. It was a power redistribution on the grandest scale. For Washington and the oil corporations that funded its foreign policy, it was an act of theft. The business community in Caracas, the old oligarchy that had ruled Venezuela for generations, was outraged. Military officers who had grown comfortable with the American alliance were enraged. And in Washington, the Bush administration interpreted Chávez's move as a direct challenge to American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, had established that the Americas were America's backyard. No power could challenge U.S. dominance. Now, a socialist leader in Latin America's most oil-rich nation was doing exactly that. By early 2002, something dark was being organized in the wealthy neighborhoods of Caracas. Retired military officers, business leaders, and CIA assets were meeting in private. They had a plan. On April 11, 2002, it was set in motion. The coup began with opposition demonstrations against Chávez. The media, controlled by Chávez's wealthy opponents, broadcast footage selectively, showing chaos and violence without context. Cameras didn't show the massive counter-demonstrations of poor Venezuelans who supported Chávez. The narrative in state television and newspapers was simple. Chávez was a dictator who had to go. What happened next is documented in declassified CIA files. The Bush administration knew about the coup weeks in advance. A CIA document dated April 6, 2002, warned that dissident military factions are stepping up efforts to organize a coup against President Chávez, possibly as early as this month. The agency didn't just know, it had the detailed plans. It knew which generals would lead it. It knew what time it would happen. Yet the White House did nothing to warn Chávez. It did nothing to prevent it. What it did was wait. On April 11, military units surrounded the presidential palace, Miraflores. Chávez, watching events unfold, appealed to loyal troops. But something unexpected happened. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, poor Venezuelans, ordinary workers, citizens with nothing to gain but their democracy poured into the streets. They surrounded the palace. They blocked the coup plotters. They sang. They chanted. They refused to let their president be taken. The military units sent to arrest Chávez found themselves surrounded by a human wall of humanity. The generals hesitated. By April 13, just 47 hours after Chávez was briefly removed from power, he was restored. The coup had failed. But the White House wasn't done. On April 12, the day after the coup began, White House spokesman Ari Fleischer stood at the podium and made a remarkable statement. He said Chávez had resigned and that a new transitional government had been installed. He blamed Chávez for the violence. He said nothing about a coup. He said nothing about the CIA's advanced knowledge. And most remarkably, he said the Bush administration would support the new government. The United States was blessing an overthrow of democracy while calling it democracy. The documents reveal the strategy. The U.S. State Department had already invested $3.3 million in training and supporting Venezuelan opposition groups, many of whom participated in the coup attempt. The National Endowment for Democracy, funded by Congress, had channeled another $877,000 to anti-Chávez organizations, including the Confederation of Venezuelan Workers, whose leaders had been CIA assets since the Cold War. This wasn't accident, this was infrastructure. This was the modernized version of coup-making. Instead of overt military intervention, the U.S. would fund, train, and coordinate local opposition movements to do the work. When the coup failed, the opposition didn't surrender. They pivoted to economic warfare. In late 2002, the Oil Workers Union, led by corrupt managers who opposed Chávez's attempts to reform the state oil company, organized a general strike. For months, Venezuelan oil exports shut down. The economy contracted. Hospitals ran short of medicines. Food disappeared from shelves. The goal was simple: create enough chaos that the population would beg for Chávez to resign, create enough hunger that the military would remove him themselves. But again, something unexpected happened. The workers who actually pumped and refined the oil, the poorest Venezuelans, refused to follow their corrupt union leaders. They crossed picket lines. They defended the oil facilities. They saved the nation's most vital industry. Chávez survived again. Then came the third attempt, the recall referendum. In 2004, opposition groups, funded again by the U.S., organized a recall vote. If 3.6 million Venezuelans signed a petition, they could force Chávez to a referendum. If he lost, he'd be removed. The U.S. poured resources into this effort. USAID and NED continued funding opposition movements, but Chávez held firm. When the referendum happened, with nearly 70% voter turnout, 59% voted to keep him. After 3 failed coups and a failed recall, the U.S. seemed to accept Chávez's survival, but the machinery of opposition, the infrastructure of funding, training, and coordination, remained in place, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something that would prove far more destructive than any coup. Oil prices were beginning to fall. Venezuela's economy, overly dependent on oil revenue, became vulnerable to global market forces beyond its control. Additionally, Chávez's government began making serious mistakes. They didn't invest adequately in oil infrastructure. They didn't maintain the facilities properly. They staffed positions with political appointees instead of experienced petroleum engineers. The revolution had a noble purpose: to use oil wealth for poor Venezuelans, but it lacked the competence to manage a complex global industry. When Chávez died in 2013, his successor Nicolás Maduro inherited a nation starting to fracture. The oil industry was already showing signs of decline, but Maduro's mismanagement accelerated the collapse. Corruption became systemic. Military officers enriched themselves. The currency collapsed. By 2016, shortages of basic goods, flour, rice, medicine, appeared regularly. Venezuelans stood in lines for hours hoping to buy food. Hospitals ran out of antibiotics. Surgeries were performed without proper anesthesia. The humanitarian crisis was real, it was devastating, and it provided the perfect justification for what the U.S. had been preparing for decades. In 2017, the Trump administration imposed financial sanctions on Venezuelan government officials and the state oil company, PDVSA. In 2019, it expanded sanctions to Venezuela's entire oil sector. The United States froze PDVSA's assets, approximately $12 billion in Venezuelan oil revenues that could have been used to import food and medicine. It barred American companies and persons from doing business with Venezuela's oil industry. It blocked the company from accessing U.S. technology, critical for refining Venezuela's heavy crude. This was economic siege warfare. Oil production declined further. From 1.3 million barrels per day in 2017, it fell to 800,000 barrels by 2025. The infrastructure deteriorated. Refineries broke down without replacement parts. Wells shut down. Venezuela, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, couldn't pump enough oil to feed itself. The human cost was incalculable. By 2019, the United Nations estimated that 94% of Venezuelans lived in poverty. 1 in 4 Venezuelans needed humanitarian assistance. Over 5.4 million Venezuelans, 1/5 of the population, fled the country. They walked through jungles, crossed dangerous borders, faced traffickers and thieves, all to escape the collapse happening at home. Venezuela experienced the worst refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Entire villages emptied. Maduro's government blamed the sanctions. Economic war, he called it. The U.S. blamed Maduro's corruption and mismanagement. Both were true, but what often went unstated was the strategic dimension. The sanctions were designed to make Venezuela ungovernable, to create such suffering that the population would demand regime change, to weaken the state until it could no longer resist. By 2025, the campaign was accelerating. Trump administration officials met with Venezuelan opposition leaders, discussing possibilities for removing Maduro. In October 2025, Trump authorized CIA covert operations in Venezuela, allegedly targeting drug trafficking, but clearly part of a larger pressure campaign. In November, Trump authorized a maritime blockade of Venezuelan oil tankers. U.S. Coast Guard vessels and Navy ships began seizing or intercepting tankers attempting to export Venezuelan oil. The blockade prevented naphtha, a critical blend stock needed to refine Venezuela's heavy crude, from entering the country. Suddenly, Venezuela couldn't even pump the oil it had. By December 2025, Venezuelan oil production had fallen by 25% in just weeks. Storage tanks were full, wells were shutting down, the economy was in free fall, the conditions were ripe. On January 3, 2026, it happened. American military forces struck. Reports vary on the scale. Some sources say it was surgical strikes on specific military targets. Others describe a larger operation. What is clear is that helicopters landed, soldiers deployed, and they took Nicolás Maduro from his home on a military base. His wife, Cilia Flores, was taken with him. Within hours, they were on an American vessel, bound for New York. The Trump administration announced that the U.S. would take control of Venezuela until a transition government could be established. Trump said the U.S. would rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. He promised that American companies would invest billions in infrastructure. He said it would be the greatest economic opportunity for Venezuela in decades. What he meant was that American oil corporations would finally have what they'd been denied since 2001, access to Venezuela's oil at profitable terms. The Venezuelan government, in a defiant statement, called the operation an act of imperialism and an attack on democracy. They said the U.S. was lying about drug trafficking and using false justifications to seize a nation's wealth. There is truth in this accusation. The U.S. has a long history of justifying interventions in Latin America through claims about communism, terrorism, or narcotics trafficking, justifications that often obscure the real motivation: control of resources and geopolitical dominance. But there is also truth in the U.S. criticisms of the Maduro regime. The government is deeply corrupt. It has violently repressed opposition movements. It has failed to govern competently. The humanitarian crisis is real and catastrophic. The difference is that these problems, serious as they are, did not develop in a vacuum. They developed under the weight of sanctions, blockades, and decades of U.S. pressure designed to destabilize the nation. This is the pattern that repeats. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, so the U.S. invaded and took the oil. Libya was a humanitarian crisis, so the U.S. intervened and destabilized the nation. Syria was fighting terrorism, so the U.S. supported coups. Venezuela became corrupt and authoritarian, so the U.S. sanctioned, blockaded, and invaded. Different justifications, same outcome: the consolidation of American power and access to resources. The question now is what happens next. Can American companies actually rebuild Venezuela's oil industry? Perhaps. Venezuela's infrastructure is devastated, but its reserves remain untapped. With billions in investment, production could potentially increase. But this requires stability, competent management, and trade relationships that may take years to establish. And it requires that Venezuelans accept a new government installed by foreign power. The collapse of Venezuela represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of resource dependence. A nation that relies on a single commodity for 95% of its export revenue is vulnerable to market fluctuations it cannot control. It's vulnerable to the interests of multinational corporations. It's vulnerable to great power competition. But it also represents something darker, a demonstration of how modern superpowers reshape nations through economic pressure, covert operations, and the threat of military force. Chávez's original sin, from Washington's perspective, was saying no. He said Venezuelan oil belonged to Venezuelans, not to American corporations. He attempted to use resource wealth to lift his people from poverty. He challenged American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. For this, he and his successor faced 2 decades of pressure: coups, sanctions, blockades, and finally, military intervention. The tragedy is that Venezuela's collapse was not inevitable. With competent governance, with adequate investment in infrastructure, with anti-corruption measures, Venezuela could have been different. But trapped between the pressures of a hostile superpower and the corruption of its own elite, the nation could not escape. Now, with Maduro gone and American forces present, the question becomes whether Venezuelans will have any say in their own future, or whether the nation's greatest resource will once again be controlled by foreign interests, leaving ordinary Venezuelans as poor as before. That is the real story of the oil trap, not that oil is curse, but that depending on oil while surrounded by great powers willing to do anything to control it is a different kind of curse entirely.